One of the most time-consuming parts of a new build can be sleeving, and it's particularly time-consuming if your cat's constantly getting in the way because they love this stuff. See? Very bothersome. So let's have a look at some of the supplies needed, some of the decisions that I had to make with respect to how I want to how I want to go about this. Right now there's sort of two main ways to sleeve cables. There's this way, which is you do your heat shrink, you do your zip tie at the end, and then you have the wires exposed at the end. And then the other way that's sort of the more enthusiast guys are going about, this is pretty in fashion these days, is the individually sleeved wires, which is both a lot of work, but both a lot of work and a lot of good looks. So you just got to decide whether you want to do that. You can buy these pre-done extensions, but extensions have some ill effects, such as you lose a little bit of efficiency in the connectors, and you lose a little bit of efficiency in the longer cables. So, and then also, okay, like the last ill effect is that now your cable is longer, so you have the original cable, which looks something like this. Here we go. The original cable, which looks something like this, which is now even longer, so you have to bunch up that extra somewhere, so it becomes a little bit harder to hide. So those are sort of the pros and cons of using these. They look good though, they're not a lot of work, and they're not very expensive compared to doing it yourself. I decided, just because I'm lazy and I had this particular sleeving lying around and the matching heat shrink tubing, so sleeving, heat shrink tubing, scissors, tape, marker, razor blade, something to mark the lengths for your heat shrink, ATX, so this is for 24 pins. Here, I'm just going to see if I can get it to focus so you guys can see what this tool looks like. 24 pins, 6 pins, and 8 pins. And then this guy is for Molex's female and male on the two respective sides. And freaking cats here again, go away. Okay, so the route I decided to go is actually slightly different. I have some challenges that I'm probably going to face here, because one of them is that I have more than 24 pins on the side of the power supply and 24 pins here, so I haven't stripped the sleeving off of it yet. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but you can see that some of these have, here, like this one for example, have 2 pins going into one motherboard pin. So I'm going to have to figure out where exactly they're coming from, because what I'm going to be doing, because I'm not quite willing to put the work in for individually sleeved, but I don't like having the exposed bits at the end, is I'm using a slightly thicker sleeving, and I am doing 2 wires per cable sleeve. So right now you can see I've got my modular, here we go, my modular 6+2. Where's the 2? Sorry, I can hardly reach with my chest tripod on here. So I've got my modular 6+2, and I've done 2 wires. Focus, please. Yep, so 2 wires per sleeve, which means that even if I bend it like this, you can't see much of the actual wire at all, even if the wire color is yellow. See, I bend this all that way, so you can only see about that much of it. But what I'll probably do when I'm routing the cables out of the video card itself is I'll have it going in like this. So I'll have a nice loose curve on it so that you can't really see it too much. So this guide will be more of a lazy man's way of doing it. If you want the OCD way to do this, and I mean OCD in like the kindest, most respectful possible sense, because it really does get fantastic results. You should check out this thread on Hardforum. And there we go, 1599965. And this is by K.A. Master, and he basically shows you guys how to do it sort of by the book and end up with the best possible results. My way is going to be fairly straightforward compared to that, so let's get started. Actually, one more side note before we get started. Sleeving, of course, isn't only useful for the cables on your power supply. In this case, these are some custom fabricated things that I did. So these are just extension cables for one fan power connector to dual fan power connectors, and I did some sort of messy soldering and taping and insulating here, and then I can take the whole thing, zip tie it, heat shrink it, and then it sort of hides it and makes it not look quite as ugly. So that's one thing you can use it for. Other cables as well, so I haven't decided how I'm going to go about this, but what I'm probably going to do is butcher these 4 adapters. So I have 4 of these Molex to dual SATA with black cable adapters. I'm going to hack them apart, and then I'm going to use these to wire up my drives on the back of the motherboard tray when I'm done here, just because I'm having a heck of a time tracking down the any kind of part number that I can use to fabricate these myself, so I'm just gonna play the hack it up game. So yeah, so we're gonna do the 8-pin connector. So this is the motherboard connector, CPU, and go step by step here on that one. Step 1 is to remove the existing sleeving. You can use either a razor blade or scissors for this, depending on how tightly packed the wires are in there. So you want to be careful if you're using a razor blade not to accidentally cut any of the wires, because remaking these cables is a heck of a lot more work than sleeving them, which is already more work than most people are willing to put into their PCs. So you just want to double check, make sure you didn't cut anything. It's good. This is just glue, residue left over from the adhesive heat shrink that was used on this cable before. So be careful when you're cutting up the existing braided sleeving, because if you cut it, if you cross cut it, then what you'll do is you'll make a real mess. Like if you cut across an area that you've already cut, because little tiny bits of this plastic will get all over the place and make just a horrifying mess. And if you're the kind of person who cleans your own house as opposed to has your mom doing it for you, then that'll be an issue. That'll be a factor. Believe me, I know the demographics of my YouTube channel. I know most of you are young, although some of you aren't. Do you know that it's 96% male who watch this channel? Go figure, right guys? So I'll remove this other end off. For this next part, an optional step would be numbering the pins before you start taking them out, but in a lot of cases it doesn't even really matter, because as long as you follow a schematic for whatever connector you happen to be putting back together, then yeah, it doesn't really make a difference as long as the voltages are right. So here we go. Actually, although, bearing that in mind, on the 24 pin, I'm probably going to go ahead and number them, especially for the ones where there are 2 wires going into one connector. So for some reason, XFX, or well, Seasonic rather, has seen fit to do it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and stick with their way just for peace of mind. So there you go. And then the next thing we do here is we use this tool. Use this tool and not any other tool. Don't use the one that looks like this. It's round but has like 2 prongs on the end, because you're probably pretty much wasting your time. Although I'm not going to do a separate guide, I will show you guys how the Molex removal tool, or like the peripheral removal tool, works. You put this in here, there's different sides for female and male, and then what you're doing is, I'm going to see if I can get the camera focused. Yep, there you go. So you are compressing these 2 pins on either side, and don't eat the sleeving, cat. You're compressing these 2 pins on either side, so that what happens is once you cover them, you can pull them out of the housing right here. So you just go like that, yeah, and then you pull out the wire. I can't really do it because the sleeving's in the way, but you guys catch my drift. So this one works much the same way, except that these are much more finicky, problematic connectors. So you got to make sure that when you're looking at the safety latch, these are sort of side to side. The pins go in the sides this way, not like sides this way, because that's where the little pins are. And then just gotta get it just right. There we go. Make sure you're down the outside. Okay, and then what I do is I usually use my palm to apply some pressure to this in here, making sure not to apply any sideways pressure because these pins can break off. So I'm applying pressure here, then I take the cable, the wire, and I apply pressure in towards the removal tool. Then I give it a little bit of a wiggle to loosen the pins, make sure that they're both caught, and then pull out. So there you go, tool's extracted, and you guys can see here now the little tiny pins that it's very important. Hold on, just see if I can get that twisted for you. So you can see the little tiny pins on either side that it's important not to ruin. And you never want to force it when you're doing this, guys, because if you force it, what can happen is you can accidentally bend the pins completely, or the little clips, the little hooks, completely backwards. And if you do that, then you basically have to cut this off, buy some of these pins, crimp it on, fabricate a completely new connector. So try not to do that. It's a real bear to deal with. So there you go. It takes about that long once you have some practice. And then the next step. For the next step, I take whatever cables I'm going to be running through the sleeving, so I've now removed all of the ends here, and then I just put a little bit of tape on them, like painter's green tape is what I'm using right now just because it comes off really easily. So this just keeps it from catching when I run it through the sleeving that I'm going to be running it through. So if you have a whole group of wires that you're doing, then you'll obviously run those through. If you're doing individual wires, then you'll obviously be doing these one at a time, but I'm doing 2 wires at a time. So you just kind of go like this until you get to the other end where I haven't removed the connector because I don't really need to. Personally, I find it kind of tricky to measure these out before I put them on, so I just go to the end, cut them. You'll need, oh, that was one of the things I didn't mention before. You'll need a lighter, or I use a little torch to just keep the ends from fraying, so you just give it a little bit of heat. Not a ton, you don't want them to start melting too bad, but just enough to keep them from completely coming apart. So now I have put the sleeving on, and sizing it is a little bit tricky. So for the heat shrink, what you want to do is you take your mark, whatever it happens to be, in my case it's a Q connector, and then you line it up, make a little mark, use a pair of sharp scissors to cut right on the mark. There are ways to do this more accurately than what I'm doing, but like I said, mine is the quick and dirty guide. And then you put that on there, making sure that you don't accidentally bend back any of the strands while you're doing this, because you'll unbraid it and make a mess. So go ahead, put that down to the end. Now, lots of different ways to terminate these. So what I used to usually do is I'd use a bigger heat shrink and I'd put a zip tie under it to make sure that it wouldn't move. But that was usually when I was trying to fit the sleeving really, really tight and have it be as compressed as possible, because the more tight it is, the more opaque it is, and the more loose it is, the more you can see through it. You guys can see my finger. So I was usually trying to go for that, whereas I'm using a higher quality braided sleeving this time. So what I'm going to be doing is going for a more loose fit. So you guys can see my connector that I'm already finished. So this guy right here. And at the power supply ends, I'm not really as worried about how tidy it is, so I'm leaving a little bit of extra braided sleeving outside of the heat shrink. And what that means is that even if the heat shrink accidentally moves a little bit, it won't actually come out completely, which is very, very pretty much impossible to fix. Whereas on the other end, I've gone for the pretty tidy approach. Okay. So where was I here? Right. So you want to get it kind of almost to the end there, and then, yeah, I guess you can pretty much heat shrink it now. So I use a torch for this. It's better to use a heat gun with like a fairly low setting, but you just kind of give it a little bit of heat. Try not to melt the connector, or especially try not to melt the braided sleeving, because that's really, really bad. Then you basically just wasted that piece because it'll be too short for anything else. So once that's done, you go ahead, make sure the orientation of the wires within the sleeving stays correct. Okay, and then you come back to the other end here, and what I usually do is sort of approximately mark. I can feel where the pin ends, and it's going to be a little bit under there. And then I just kind of burn through it, get the pins out, take off my masking tape, just kind of cut that off there. Like I said, this is totally the lazy way. I'm not doing it by the book, but I showed you guys how to do it by the book as well. Basically follow that guide by someone more skilled and more patient than me. And then what I do is I loosen up the cable sleeving a little bit, just because I'm not going for like a super tight fit. I just don't want it to move. And then that gives me some idea of where I stand. So now I can see that I have to cut away just a tiny bit more and make sure these 2 wires are the same here. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Actually, I might not need to cut away much more at all, because I don't want it to be too tight. Yeah, just a little bit more. So what I'll do is I'll quickly burn it, and then while it's still hot, just so that I don't end up with like globs at the end. Burn it, mush it, just to get rid of a little bit more. I don't like cutting it with the scissors at this point, because if you cut a little bit too much, then what'll happen is you will be stuck. Sorry, let me just cut that bit off. You'll be stuck because you'll then have to burn it a little bit. And then once you burn it a little bit, after you've cut it a bit too much, then you can end up with, like, you know, a big mess of like globby bits at the end, which you then have to cut off, and then all of a sudden you've gone too far, and that's problematic. So I'm just kind of trimming this back, keeping on doing this, being sure not to, you know, burn away the the jacket on the wires. Mush, mush, mush. Okay, yeah, should be good. Okay, so now what we do is, and this is critical, this is a very important step, make sure you put on your other piece of heat shrink wrap. Mark and cut. Okay, so I put that on, because if you forget to do this and you reattach the connector, then you have to take them off again, and that sucks. So once you've put on your heat shrink, chuck your cat out of the way, and then you find the connector, which I seem to have misplaced. You check either another connector, you check a schematic online, or you label them in the first place. So here I got my two CPU connectors, so it looks like black ones go at the top. Which ones are these? So I'm doing these to correspond pretty much directly, so I'm going to take this, and I'm going to turn it around, and I'm going to go, okay, well then these ones go right about here. Making sure the orientation of the wires is correct before I try to put them in. Clip and clip. And then I make sure my heat shrink tubing completely covers the sleeving this time. Make sure it's not too loose or too tight. Yeah. And then I go ahead and give it the old heat. Really careful with the heat if you guys are using an open flame for this part, because it's very easy to accidentally melt this and then it'll start to fray and then you made a real mess of everything. So there you go. I have now sleeved my two wires. That is pretty much how to do cable sleeving. I don't know if I'm missing anything in particular. So thank you for checking out my little guide, and I'm sorry it was